Sorry for shouting then. No wonder nobody heard me at the back. Do apologise. I wasn't just being grumpy. Okay. Right. If you're not speaking, please can you turn your microphone off for those who have microphones in front of them. Right. If anyone caught me chatting to someone in the lunch break, it was another inspector who's doing another inquiry in the building. Didn't discuss the case. He just came to say hello. Just to let you all know. If anyone does want to view the presentation who's watching online, it's under CD 8001, the actual presentation. So if you want to bring that up, if you're watching online, and then you can get a clearer picture of it during the presentation, then please do so. I was offered a visit to one of the Park Home residents during the interested party speaking. I'm happy to do that. Are the appellants happy for that to happen? Okay, so if somebody from the Rule 6 or the council can organise that, please, and that can be fed into part of the site visit. Mr. White, this morning you mentioned about visits to other studios. Do you want to have a chat with the other parties as to which studios they think that will be beneficial for me to visit, or do you have a suggestion which studios?
Well, can we park that decision till you might find that you will be obviously principally in the third week, or is it the second? We are spending a lot of time on need where all these, actually it's towards the end of next week with Mr. Kershaw and Mr. Fannin, but more Mr. Kershaw, a lot of these studios will be referred to. And I don't think you need to give an answer now, but if you would just mull on whether you would prefer in advance of that 3 or 4 days evidence where you will hear a lot about different studios. Actually, indeed, the Rule 6, you're going to hear a lot about Pinewood next Tuesday, well, actually next Wednesday. Will you just have a think about what would assist you? Because it might be now you've got a hole on Tuesday, the 28th of January, because we're not hearing whether you would want to rise slightly earlier at the end of Mr. Smith's evidence and go and have a look at some of these before you hear the need evidence, which will refer to the studios. So, I mean, as you can see from my list, I think there were probably, frankly, that Mr. Davis particularly refers to, and Mr. Kershaw, there are probably 15 to 20 studios in play. But I'm not suggesting, of course, you go and see them all.
No.
But there are also some studios relating to residential amenities. So could we potentially ask you to mull on whether you would find it a benefit to go and have a look at the general? I mean, Pinewood, for example, you might want to orientate yourself for next Wednesday and the Rule 6 parties evidence on Pinewood. You might want to orientate yourself in relation to Shinfield, Pinewood, Shepperton. Those are probably the 3 most obvious studios to go and have a look at. There's also Leavesden, which is just by north of Watford, and Skye Elstree, if you wanted to expand it. I mean, obviously all within the West London cluster, but why don't you think about it? And I'm certainly not suggesting an accompanied site visit.
Okay.
But I think it might well benefit for you to get a sense of some of these places that we're going to talk a lot about next week.
Okay. Are you suggesting I just go and have a look at the site from public vantage points rather than actually an arranged visit to the studios itself?
At the moment, but if you, having heard the need evidence, feel that, I'm sure we, in conjunction with Bucks, I mean, as we know, Pinewood, for example, I'm sure if Mr. Bird's instructing solicitor made the request of Pinewood, the door would swing open because it is a Bucks County Council location. So if you felt, because there is going to be quite a bit of technical evidence next week on how the studios will operate, and actually Mr. Tester as well has got the point about how the internal roads operate. So why don't you just quietly over the next 24, 48 hours have a think about what would assist you, and we can go to the full Monty, which is trying to get you into a studios, to unaccompanied lists that might be beneficial for you to look at before the evidence or unaccompanied after the evidence.
Yeah, thank you. Any thoughts, Mr. Bird?
Madam, I can see the benefit of at least visiting the vicinity of, say, for example, Pinewood, so you get an appreciation of the context. It may be that you decide in due course that a visit to a studio would assist you, but certainly I think we can see the benefit of at least and certainly for understanding the evidence, at least to understand some of the locations that you're going to be referred to.
Thank you. Right, I'll have any thoughts, Miss Nevin? Sorry.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. In principle, it could be helpful for you indeed to go and have a look. Might we also like reserve our position if we feel there's maybe a list we think of the ones that would be most helpful to you, given that you're obviously not going to be able to visit every single one in a spreadsheet. And perhaps when the time comes for that, at a convenient moment, we might even come together to the parties and suggest which ones might be most helpful to you, unless you have any thoughts of your own.
No, it would be helpful for me if you could provide maybe a short list that you think would be beneficial to go and have a look at just from public land. And then if there's one that you think that it would be beneficial to actually look at in terms of inside the studios to get a better feel for the sort of, like you said, the technicalities of it, then if you could agree on which one that should be, that would be helpful to me. I mean, you've just mentioned Pinewood might be easier to access because of the council. I don't know, but I'll have a think about it. But a short list of the ones that you want me to go and see from public land would be helpful, please. Okay. I asked for a plans pack at the case management conference. I haven't seen one. Has one been done or not yet?
Yes, I think it has, and it's in one of the boxes behind us. But could we just, I know Mr. Canavan from Cartagena is just putting together your list of what the plans are. We're obviously going to show that to Mr. Fannon and Mr. Fannon's colleagues. It's just before we present the list. Obviously, it won't be much use to you unless you're content that the LPA agree with it. So could we get that list, and then probably in the space of 24 hours, we will then present the box with the plans.
Yeah, that's
But
fine.
Is that, but don't worry, that you will see various boxes protruding on the shelf there. One of them has a whole bundle of application plans, but we just don't want to hand it to you and then have to amend it, frankly, or take things out or add to it. So in the next 24 hours, we'll try and get the list finalised and then make sure you have the plans before the end of the week.
Thank you very much. Okay, and then reason for refusal light has been resolved, which is to do with the offsetting thing. The statement of common ground I've got says that there was an update from Natural England that needed to be confirmed too. I know it says there's no outstanding disagreements, but is there anything from Natural England that's come through? Can you check? Yeah, thank you. Okay, anything else from anybody else before I start to hear from Mr. Pryor? Nope. Okay. Any other core docs apart from the presentation I need to have a look at?
I don't think so, ma'am. I mean, I think I foreshadowed at the CMC, what I intend to do is introduce Mr. Pryor, and then as you will see on the screen, he has the presentation, which I hope is that. I know you've got your own monitor, but obviously Mr. Pryor will be changing at his pace.
Yeah, I'll just probably watch that because I've dropped out on the Wi-Fi again. So I'll just watch yours and I'll just ignore my screen.
So, Mom, can I just check? Have you got a microphone in the way of? Mum, can you see the screen adequately? Is it clear enough for you, or do you need it slightly more angled towards you? And also, can I say, I don't mind if Miss Nevin, frankly, wants to go and sit up here, because it might be impossible for you to see the presentation from where you are. No, that's the problem.
PDF version that's been uploaded into the core documents just
It is.
earlier.
But what I want to avoid, frankly, is Mr. Pryor saying there are, what are there, roughly 100 plus. It's just very tedious if every time 106 slides, if every time he has to say new slide.
Okay. Is there
So I
a
don't,
need for us to move up? That would
yeah,
be
why don't you just
welcome.
move up? I think that would be eminent.
If anybody wants to move up, I don't mind. I mean, it's going to be a little unusual, but if people want to sit in the middle here watching wires so that they can see the screen, I'm not bothered at all if you want to do that. Or behind. I know it's not normal practice, but if you want to see the screen, then shift your buttons.
Yeah, I mean, Alina, don't be modest. Come up, because is there anyone who?
I may just move this one, Mr. Prime.
You do what you like.
About an hour and a bit.
Yeah, okay.
So, Mum, with your leave, can I introduce Mr. Pryor, and then I will effectively let him run on his own steam. But can I introduce you formally to the inquiry as the first witness for the appellants, please, Mr. Pryor? Can you confirm that you are a landscape architect and the chief executive officer and co-founder of Pryor and Partners?
I am.
And that was a practice that you founded with others in 2018. Is that correct?
Yep.
You also, in terms of your academic qualifications, you have a postgraduate diploma in landscape architecture from the Manchester Metropolitan University, and you've been trained and operated as a master planner and landscape consultant for 40 years. Is that correct?
Correct.
Prior to that, you were chief executive of the planning, design and development teams at ACOM, and you also the president of EDAR.
Yep.
For 2 terms, you were landscape commissioner at CAVE, and you also chaired the Inclusive Access Group. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you basically, I think in your presentation, you have a few other instructions that I'll let you introduce. So, Mr. Pryor, feel free to take over now. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you through the scheme through a series of chapters, and I think my purpose here is to show how all the layers of the development come together, how this adds up to what we think is an exciting and compelling proposition. But also, I think, due deference to all those in the room who have objections to this, see problems with it. You'll see as we go through that I think we've addressed many of those and taken them on through the process. So I'm going to run through the brief that we received and the brief that we developed, our approach to the site and our assessment of the site as we found it and as we see it today. I'm going to take you through the proposals, and then I'm going to catch up as to what happened, as it were, post the original submission and some of the refinements of the scheme that have taken place. We are a practice of about 100 people based in London, multicultural, very diverse, and we specialise entirely in master planning around the world, across the UK, but a lot overseas. Work that I've personally done, I led the master plans for the London Olympics and its legacy scheme. Actually, I was just thinking this morning, the last time I was at a public inquiry was 20 years ago for the land acquisition for the London Olympics. We did the Rio Olympics. Recently, we did the Dubai Expo. I'm currently involved in some very significant projects for zero carbon circular economy communities on the west coast of the States. We are just finished the national plan for Bhutan and the plans for the city of Thimphu, the capital city. We're about to start detail work on that now. And then Al Lula is one of these huge cultural projects in Saudi Arabia, where I was there last week. That's the southern end of the Nabatean community. Got Petra in the north, Hega in the south, and all the culture that goes with it. Huge projects looking at both cultural integration, landscape restoration, and tourism potential. In my early days of practice, I did a lot of work around quarries, landfill, and restoration. So I kind of understand the mechanics of these sites. The European City of Culture in Liverpool and the pier head and the introduction of the new canals there. And then I led on the rebuild of Manchester after the '96 IRA bomb, and have spent the last 20 years working with the city on various strategies. So master planning is what we do. It's the world we're involved in, but it's a process of, I suppose, of bringing together and aligning a lot of different skill sets to add up to a place. It's more of a convening profession than necessarily anything else. Very early on in this project, we were in discussion with our client team about who to bring together, and I think they chose, beyond ourselves, an exceptional group of consultants, from landscape architects to broader advisors, Sterling Prize-winning architects, design was always held up as being an important ambition of the project, and this team was assembled early on as we started to look at it. What I'd like to do today is give you an overall view of the design project and process, and whilst beneath it on this diagram for landscape, transport, planning, ecology and noise, we have other witnesses who will give the detailed information on that. So I will provide the context, others will answer those questions. So I think that the briefing process for this was really interesting, because the brief really was about the achievement of a world-class outcome. How do we get to be the best film studio in the world? How do we get ahead of the competition? What's needed to do something exceptional in the context of the UK and global film industry? The brief was pretty simple. And as you could probably note from my earlier projects I presented, a lot of our work is addressing challenges from the get-go. I'd never done Olympic Games before. I've never done a city rebuild before, but each time we go into those, we kind of strip back the brief, re-examine what we have to do. So what we wanted to achieve here was something that was world-class, that addressed some of the concerns of the film industry, particularly around things like sustainability, adaptability, flexible, a great place to work. How do you get the best people in the world to come and work at a particular place? And then critically, I suppose, how do you embed that in a local community and give it true local value? One of the things that became very apparent in our research early on is this issue of critical mass. How do you get somewhere to really work when the film industry is cyclical? There are films going through a process of writing and thinking and development and filming and making and production. How does that sit alongside other projects being introduced? You can't just start one and finish one and then go and find another one. You need an overlapping process. So that led us to, I suppose, an idea of capacity. How many films would you need to be doing at any one time? What stage in those processes would they be? And what would people need to find around them in order to see this as the place they want to be and the place they want to make films in? And certainly one of the instructions to us was, can we recapture that sense of place and position that major studios used to have? Can we reflect that today in the place that we create here? And it is an extraordinary industry, and many of you will know about it, but to combine absolute bleeding edge technology in terms of vision, sound, imagination, all the technologies, AI we heard about earlier, all of those technologies supported by people who can still make chain mail in the way it was made in the 15th century, who can still produce the costumes and the scenery and all the extraordinary crafts that go to underpin the realism of these projects is quite an extraordinary thing. That marriage of craft, of cultural ambition with the technology of filmmaking, I have to say I found absolutely fascinating all the way through this process. And in doing that, because as we've heard, there is competition around the world for these places, how do we create the inspiring place that people want to come to make films here in Buckinghamshire as part of that West London cluster we're going to hear about? And certainly one of my experiences from working with, let's say the tech industries in the States is clusters and the ecologies of clusters, and we'll come on to this in a moment. The strength within those is an incredibly powerful component of why places become the places where people want to be. People cluster around an idea, that depth of talent. So how do we get the talent here? How do we create the working environment that they want to be in? And as we'll talk about later, how do we feed those people into the systems through training and learning so that we're addressing, again, one of the issues that was raised earlier about competitiveness in the industry is how do we bring people into the process to make it really work? And then what's the environment we all want to work in? And we've seen this, you know, when you see people build health industry parks, research parks, etc., they are places which have both buildings and environments. You're trying to attract the best in the world. What environment do you want them to be in? How do you want them to work? How do you want them to integrate? And one of the big things for the film industry at the moment that we're hearing, of course, is our carbon footprint and sustainability. Are we sustainable as a place to work? And we've heard a lot today about the big sheds, the sound sheds, the sound stages, and I'll come on to those. Actually, they're very complex places. The mix of studio space, workshops, office production, post-production, community places, the back lots, the amenities, the cafes, the places you hang out, the places where you show films to each other, the places where you engage with your fellow practitioners, where do those sort of serendipitous moments happen? So space is about both the buildings, the range of buildings, the proximity of those buildings, but also the public realm we put around that and the environment in which we sit in. So a critical part of the way the industry works is the clustering of assets. So we all know in our minds that, and you can see them elsewhere, the big sound stages, but sitting around those is a whole raft of additional spaces. Workshops to build some really quite dramatic things. Workshops that migrate therefore up to places where you're making minute things like wands, I suppose, and rings and costumes, and then office space as well. And one of the things I think we got from talking to a wide range of the industry was how you might layer and cluster those things together in proximity of the soundstage. And one of the great advantages of us starting from scratch at this point in the cycle and the industry development is to us to think about that workflow from the get-go and assemble all of those pieces in the right way, but also give them flexibility and I suppose the advantage of being able to be flexible in how they're put together and how they operate. So in terms of how we put those clusters together, what we tend to see is a collection of sound stages. We have a thing called a unit base. This is in the classic images is where the stars caravans are parked, but it's actually the working area outside where the heart of the filmmaking process. And then around that is this combination of workshops and offices and production space and amenities that sit around it. So you can start to see there's a model of how you design a film studio, how the components go together, and how you service and access it. And this will film the kind of building blocks of how we put the scheme together. So that's the brief about place, quality, place to work, attractiveness, but also functionality. That's what we started to work on, those component parts and how do they come together to give us something very compelling. So if we then look at the site, you're going to hear a lot about the West London cluster, Marlow in terms of how it sits in that in the middle of the Chilterns. Again, we'll come back to landscape issues and where we sit, but it sits in an incredible ecology of film production space. And let's not forget, this is now one of the great filmmaking areas on the planet. There's so much happening here. There is we've heard various numbers quoted, but this is one of the great filmmaking areas. And in that cluster, in that ecology of studios, are the workforce, are the craftspeople, are the filmmakers, are that sort of dispersed skill base that makes something like this really work. And as you can see in other parts of the world with other industries, the nature of those clusters, the ecology of those clusters become a critical part of their ultimate global success. I'm a big believer in them. And then the location itself, the site itself. Again, we're gonna hear a lot about this sort of relative position of the studio proposition to Marlow. But I think my initial view was, and I got a phone call saying, were we interested in being involved in this project? And before I gave my answer, I said, well, I'll go and think about it. And of course, first thing you do is visit the site, think a little bit about the industry, walk around. And we were very aware from the get-go that in those days it was an AOMB, Winter Hill, our setting in the Thames Valley, our proximity to Marlow. We know about the Green Belt. We're very clear about the challenges. But I have to say, my initial view was, and my view still is very strongly today, that a site adjacent to an urban area with major transport infrastructure on pre-used land was in the heart of the filmmaking cluster of the UK, was something very well worth pursuing, as long as we did it right, as long as we hit the metrics that would emerge out of the briefing process, and was acknowledging that there are pros and cons with various of these site sitting issues. This struck me as ultimately, in that broadest sense, particularly with the infrastructure provision and proximity of Marlow, a very sustainable place to reuse land and pursue this project. The connections are great, and we've heard a lot about transport issues, and Mr. Dix will go on to that later, but we sit on major national infrastructure. We sit in a place that's accessible, and we have the ability, as it were, to layer greater transport permeability onto the site. We're connected. We've heard about the footpaths that run through the site and the connections to east and west, the footbridges, the proximity of the Thames Pass, the Chiltern Way to the north. We're connected. We're part of this wider network. The green belt is obviously a huge consideration of this inquiry. Others will talk about it, but of course, from the get-go, we recognised the role of the green belt. That will drive us in many ways towards a consideration of efficient land use, but also in terms of how we respond around our building typologies, our roof treatments, our scale, etc. So knowledge from the get-go that was something we had to address seriously with this exceptional proposition. We sit within an area with some strategic ecological assets. We've heard today about the more local ecological components of the site. And of course, we've had ecologists all over this since the get-go, and there's ecology evidence being provided later in the site. But ecology and improving the ecological condition became a fundamental part of how we started to shape the site, connect pieces up, where we build, where we don't build, and our treatments of roofs and water systems, layering those into the process. And then the wider landscape setting. Again, my colleagues will talk about this in some measure, but we sit, as it were, between two great bits of landscape in the floodplains of the Thames. We sit within, as it were, that populated valley bottom with these very special landscapes to either side of us, recognizing the importance of those landscapes, but recognizing the contribution we might make to that broader urban feel within the valley bottom and where we sit and how we respond. The national landscape, of course, significantly important, and critically, as we work through the scheme, I hope you'll see that we've responded to that. We've taken due cognizance of it and understand where we sit, but we're not in that landscape. We are outside it. We're not sat in those sensitive landscapes. We're set in proximity. Now, the site itself largely comprised the parkland of Westhorpe House. That, of course, started to be taken apart post the Second World War, the extraction of gravel, the building of the 404, creating that, as it were, edge to Marlow at that point. Gravel extraction followed by filling with water, and then after that, the depositing of landfill into those sites. And I think you'll see on the site visits that those extractive and filling industries and what they've done to the land are fairly obvious in terms of how the terrain sits there, edge conditions, vegetation, etc. We have a number of water bodies, so that filling operation stopped, and we have a number of lakes. And the overall feel is that we have, as it were, a more open field to the northern part of the site and a more complex area to the south. That's reflected both in the landscape, but also in terms of the ecological interest. And again, I'll come back to that. So the site today, there are images on the screen, but of course best served by visiting the site, walking the footpaths, and getting an idea of the feel of the place. But as you can see on this screen here, largely open areas which reflect most of the landfill to the north, and then coming down to more complex lakeside and vegetated areas to the south as we come down towards the Thames. So that legacy of mineral extraction and landfill has effectively underpinned the characteristics of the site, certainly from a landform and vegetation point of view. But it became a sort of reference point for the scheme design. What are the areas of the site that we might think are more appropriate to develop on, and those areas that might actually hark back to those ambitions about a great place to work, the environment that lies around the place we're creating? How do we connect to that? And actually, how do we connect local residents and others to that asset? So we started to see value, as it were, in the differences between the various parts of the site and what they might do for the project. This is a topographical model of the site, but essentially what it tells us is that the site basically has its high point up on the Marlow Road. We descend, as it were, towards the Thames, which is down here. But each of the sites that have we're looking to build on. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Never touched the screen. Each of the sites we're looking to build on effectively have been adjusted by those landfill activities. And even as we come down towards the south, we sit, as it were, above the floodplain. Now, people talked about the floodplain earlier. We don't have any flood objections in the project, as I understand it, because we have, as it were, land that's raised above those issues. We heard earlier about the ecology of the site. We've looked at we've had a number of ecological surveys running through the seasons across the site. We've tracked bird life, mammal life, reptiles, plant species, mapped those onto the site. We know where those areas of interest are, but also in knowing those things, how do we conserve, how do we improve habitats, how do we connect habitats? But secondly, can we look to enhancement? And you'll see that biodiversity net gain is 20%. And again, I think that's agreed, but we have a proof later on in the process to discuss that. If we look at that point I was making about the interest across the site, the kind of more simple ecology to the north, a more complex matrix ecology to the south. And that sort of conservation of that and working with that becomes part of our design process. And then here you'll see on the right-hand side, the sort of mapping of tree cover. Again, most of it to the edges, as you'd expect from sites that have been quarried and landfilled, and they start to film, as it were, the armature of our edge condition as we put the landscape and development scheme together. We have, of course, a number of important neighbours, and we've heard from some people today about where they sit relative to that. We have Westhorpe House itself, Westhorpe Park Homes within the old walled garden. We have residents to the south in particular. They're numbered on the plan here, but the response to neighbours becomes a major part of our thinking process as we start to design the scheme. There's some heritage, of course. The Westhorpe house is listed. There's the main house and then a more contemporary extension on the back. There is Thimble Cottage and Corners Cottage to the south as well. Cornish Cottage, of course, being the listed building. And then some indications on the left here of how land has changed over time as part of the evolution of Westhorpe Park Estate itself, and then its sort of exploitation and changes in more recent decades. So I think in summary, if we put all those constraints together, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with more complex ecology and landscape structure to our south, important east-west footpaths. We have our views from the north and south. We have the implications of water table and floodlands to the south, and that basically informs how we handle our surface water during the process. And then we, of course, have our sensitive neighbours sitting to the south of the project. So before we start designing anything, assessing all of those components, understanding how they will work with each other, builds us, as it were, a framework in which we can pursue the development of the design. And then, as mentioned this morning, aspirations around RUR4. I won't go into those, others will, but recognising ourselves that we sat within that ambition. And where that really led us to was what provision could we make in the project to add recreational space and access to the countryside as part of where we were taking the design process, and of course the value and connections of the footpaths that run between the sites Marlow and Little Marlow. So there's the brief, there's the site, there's our understanding of the site, there's our understanding of the importance of the landscape setting. All of those become effectively the building blocks of then how we start to address the project, bearing in mind our ambition is world-class, as good as it gets, a great place to work, a compelling place to make film and TV in the UK. So the proposals that we've all seen on the master plans map out like this. We have our major entrance to the north. We enter the site, Mr. Dix will talk about the road arrangements. We have our, as it were, entry sequence to the north of the site. That is how you arrive, what you see, first impressions. And then as you'll see, as it were, the studios, as it were, sitting either side of the access road down to Westhorpe House. And we'll come on to talk about this in more detail. That gives us, as it were, our 2 production zones for feature films, 4 production zones for high-end TV. But you'll notice that wrapped around that, in the brown buildings and the other coloured buildings, are the workshops and offices and other things that make this whole complex work. And it's the variety and specificity of those buildings that adds this up to something really special. As we come further south, here's our major east-west footpath running through the site. As we come further south, as we get to those more complex areas of landscape and ecology, we come to our culture and education building, which I'll come back to. And then right down at the south here, proposition around the back lot, where outdoor filming will take place. So how did that come together? If you start to look at the site, it starts to map itself out in terms of those key characteristics. Either side of the lane to Westhorpe House are large flat areas suitable for the types of buildings we're looking at. We need contiguous level areas. Those big buildings need to be contiguous with the unit bases that sit between them. We need to be able to move things between buildings smoothly, so levels across the site are really important. We need to be able to separate areas of film production from each other. The confidentiality around film production, the ideas, I'll come on to it. The ideas that are held within each of those studios don't need to mix up with each other. So be able to separate, to secure is very important. To sit ourselves within an overarching structure of landscape becomes clear. So we now have, as it were, in our minds, 2 areas for our major areas of development and to shape and craft our production. We recognize that in each of those 2 areas, those 2 production clusters, we're going to need some common elements. We're going to need sound stages, we're going to need unit bases, we're going to need the supporting offices and workshops that go with them in close proximity. On top of that, very early on in the design process, I suppose our examination of skill base and making sure that we have permanent skill base in the area led us to look at what we were calling halo industry sites. So where do you put people who want to be permanently on site that will be the difference, the permanent support technical offer to a film studio, where you have workers coming in and out to make productions, but you have permanent facilities in terms of key skills, key assets that any film will need. And we decided to sit those, as it were, outside those secure areas. They're free and easy to access, but they become a really, really important part of the offer in terms of how successful the studio will be over time. We also have a series of amenity areas. And we think this is also a critical differentiator for the project in terms of what it provides for social interaction, a sense of belonging, a place to gather, a place to put those critical facilities that will make this successful in the long term. So as we start to layer these building blocks up on the site, we also looked towards our area to the south. From the get-go, there was a strong ambition about training to, as we heard earlier, that feeding inner skill sets into the film industry is critical for our long-term viability. We also looked at our outdoor filming capability. We need an element to do that. And actually, very early on in the public consultation process, we were asked to flip those 2 components to take outdoor filming further south, away from Westhorpe House, as we got feedback through some of those public meetings. So we now have, as it were, 2 production units. We have our areas of halo business. We have our amenities on the site. We found a position where we thought to put our training and cultural centre just sitting outside the main filmmaking area, but proximate to where films are happening, and then a suitable location for our outdoor filming. Into that, we fed an idea about public streets and public realms and public squares, places where you could move in a high quality environment, where we could introduce our landscape and public realm creation, where we could look at really creating, I suppose, that sense of place and that distinctive element that makes this a compelling place to go to work on a regular basis. And it was, I suppose, a deficiency we saw in other film studios, that that sort of sense of belonging, sense of place didn't really exist in terms of how the public realm was shaped and formed. So putting that structure into the project, using that structure, as it were, to link together the various areas of film or TV production in all the subdivisions that we might see in that, all the different subcomponents of filmmaking could be accessed through these areas, and then to make certain that we have our amenity and our studio hub access from all of that network. And I'll come back to talk about the studio hub in a moment. Our public footpath becomes a critical element running east-west through the project, but critically, how do we connect that to a wider range of paths that take us into the more interesting and accessible parts of the site and our education and cultural area? So the scheme at a glance. The images on the left are images that came out of the landscape design and architectural process. It's a place of active streets. It's vital, has real ambition about placemaking, a sort of traditional form of working streets that we think is really important. A landscape structure, as we'll see later, carries things like our SUD systems, our ecological strategies, water management, all in those systems. Emphasis on walking and cycling through the site, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. But within that overall proposition, a strong structure of streets and buildings linked together by a powerful public realm, linking up the various components of the project. We added the studio hub into the project as, I suppose, our center of gravity, and I'll come on to talk a little bit about that later in terms of the role it performs. But you will notice from the plans that most of our larger buildings are concentrated towards the center of the site, and we put our smaller, more articulated buildings to the north and south, where they are adjacent to footpaths or adjacent to major roads, or in this case to the south, close to West Thorpe Park home and local residents. The ecology strategy and its underpinnings, and again, colleagues will talk about this later in the inquiry, set out, as it were, to take the underlying structure of the site, reinforce it, and reconnect it. It also looked to have due deference to the ecological resources that sat on the site at the moment, on the basis of the surveys that are taking place, and then to introduce a new overlay of ecology into the site through our treatment of our landscape, our roof coverage, our treatment of West Thorpe Park Lane, and critically, how we handle surface water in ponds and connected rivulets and SUD systems. So lane, as it were, through the project is a sort of ecological armature that becomes a sort of glue in the system of the landscape and the placemaking. We looked a lot at tree planting, tree canopy plant areas. We looked at the greening of roof structures, but we're in a working environment. So lots of discussion with those in the film industry about where we could sensibly put vegetation, where it would last through the hard working process of making films. But I think one of the strongest assets we had was both our strong edge condition, and then of course West Thorpe Park Lane moving through the site gave us this great armature to break up, as it were, the site itself, the buildings, and as it were, maintain that green access down to West Thorpe Park House itself. We looked very closely at our edge condition, how we reinforce the buffers. Those become critical parts of our ecological strategy, how we join those habitats together. But where we put and reinforce our edge condition of our landscape becomes part of both our screening, part of how we settle into the landscape, part of how we address the longer range views, and also how we, as it were, deal with the very necessary issues of security at the edge of the site within our landscape structures. We looked, as it were, to the north of the site and the views from the AONB. I'll come back to this in a moment in terms of how there is a change in the design that's gone on. But we were making decisions along the lines of retaining existing poplar trees for as long as required until they, as it were, the new landscape and more appropriate landscape we would be planting would take over those screening functions. We were concerned with our interface with Westthorpe Park homes themselves. That standoff, as we've heard, the homes sit within the old walled garden of Westthorpe Park House. There's a fairly high wall that sits around them, but putting a landscape buffer, as it were, between the two, we think was important, as well as reducing the scale of buildings close to Westthorpe Park House. And then we look at the section, as it were, through various parts of the site, looking at those standoff distances. But this is areas, you know, to be carefully considered, an area of strong landscape intent. So that overarching landscape approach created a whole series of character areas, from the reinforcement of our ecological capabilities and a sort of wilderness feel around our existing lakes, the creation of this accessible recreation space close to our culture and training centre, the strengthening of the landscape structure along our east-west footpaths, the major armature of Westthorpe Park House itself and all of the additional landscape pieces that go with that, strong reinforcement of our east and west landscape, and then of course the treatment of our northern landscapes as they address the special landscape area, the AONB, and not least, I suppose, our roof treatments that are both part of our ecological strategy, our landscape strategy, and a critical part of our water management system, because it delays flows off the roof. So the land use model, as it started to emerge, as we've heard earlier, about 168,000 square meters, 1.7 million square feet of developments. Some 43,000 square meters of that is the sound stages, large numbers of buildings in the production, office, workshop area, amenity buildings, and then of course our studio hub and our training and culture area. So a variety of building typologies, as we'll see, a variety of architecture, buildings distributed in such a way as to respond to the context that we found ourselves in. And I think this diagram looks to sum that up. Recognition that our larger buildings are towards the centre of the site, that a stronger, more articulated form of architecture forms our northern boundaries, i.e. facing outwards to the AONB. An articulated building form a lower scale of building, a more human scale of building, addressing our east-west footpath. Smaller scale, a more articulated scale of building close to Westthorpe Park House. I would say a quite beautiful design by the architect of the Culture and Skills Academy. And then a number of amenity buildings within the project that starts, as it were, give again a sort of personal scale to the places and the public realm within the sites. So as we look at the building forms and we look at the architecture, they're responding to both that brief about a place of excellence, but they're also responding to where we sit, close to our neighbours, where we sit within a broader landscape, how we address scale, how we address architecture, materiality, I'll come on to. Now the buildings are quite complex, so we've heard reference to sound stages. These are complex buildings. They are, despite the word, no sound shall escape them, no sound will get in. They're highly insulated. They have very powerful roof structures because we need to suspend from them most of our scenery. They have big data capability. They can be climate ameliorated. They can carry intensive lighting. They have very strong floors, so you can move a kit in and out. They're highly accessible. They are plugged in, as it were, to the surrounding levels, as I said earlier. In our case, they have green roofs and they have photovoltaics on those in combination. So we're looking to both our habitat creation, and that is also, of course, a critical part of our water management rainfall system. So this is a fairly complex building in terms of what looks like a simple shed. It's simply and elegantly designed, but it is a building that's doing a very significant job. I know we haven't had any design objections to the project, but I think I just reflect on some of the architectural approaches that were taken. Simple structures, simple color palettes, screening on sensitive frontages with addition of planting, strong landscape structure, robust buildings, concrete bases with cladding material above, recognizing that this is a working area, people are going to bang into things. Clean building design. Flat roofs, of course, give us that advantage of both settling the buildings more easily in the landscape at that scale, but also how we treat green roofs, photovoltaics, etc. There's a whole variety of sound stages. And again, part of the investigation through the briefing process was how big do these buildings need to be? How tall do they need to be? What assets do they need? What's the capabilities that run through them? And they run the whole gamut from bigger singular buildings, conjoined buildings, all the way through to type F, which sits on this red box here, which is the new types of studios for digital filming, where your digital scenery is in the round, and when you're acting, as it were, within that digital environment. So to the earlier point that was being made about how the film industry is evolving and evolving quickly, these buildings, I think, give us absolute flexibility around that, and we're already anticipating some of those models of change in the way that we're starting to lay the project out and the building typologies that we're presenting. We have a whole series of office and workshop centres. You know, I think if when you go and maybe go and look at some of these other studios, you quite often see the workshop space, somewhat temporary buildings, often with fabric roofs, take up quite a lot of room. We made the decision very early on in discussions with the industry to start layering these things up. Okay, it's a more expensive building typology, but it gives us this unique ability to put offices over workshops, over production space. It's very efficient, but what our conversations with those who are making these films is the ability literally to run up and down stairs between those elements, keep an eye on everything, to tweak everything, not have to get on your scooter and go half a mile across the site is hugely valuable. That led us to a view that we could create, as it were, a stronger urban setting, more active streetscape, but we could bring people closer together to get that real sort of sense of animation and excitement in the place. So the resolution around workshops and offices become a really important part of this. And they come in different forms across the project, in different locations. Typically, though, where they look out to either public roads or land to public paths or onto Westthorpe Park Lane, they have a much more articulated frontage, much more sensitive frontage in terms of their design. I said earlier, some of them at the perimeter had articulated roofscapes. We are responding to the important setting that we're in. We have a responsive architecture. And again, I would say that's not typical of most studio areas. Most of them have got a model and they stick to it. We have multiple building typologies on this site looking to create a really strong architectural form and setting, but also an appropriate response to the landscape and placement in which we sit. And so you can see the different responses in terms of those building typologies and materiality, how they're put together. And we believe that that is a vital part of keeping this up at the leading edge of attractive places to work and make films. So all of those different workshop typologies are on this screen here. There's a lot of them. They're responding to particular needs. They're giving variety, they're giving choice. And critically within those buildings, there's a lot of flexibility about how they're used. And again, from everything we were hearing from the film industry, that ability to be flexible, that ability to make choice, that ability, as it were, to, if you imagine you're bringing these huge teams together, the space in which you put them and the ability of the buildings to flex around those team needs through that production process becomes absolutely critical. And I would argue is a major part of the competitive offer that we're trying to put out there. And then the other big piece in there, of course, I spoke about earlier, is the unit base. As I said, I was new to this world when we first started talking to the industry, and the unit base is the sort of most hallowed ground. And what I can see at the middle of film production, this is the place where the great setup takes place, where scenery is assembled and moved in. to our sound stages. It's where a lot of the work takes place, as it were, to generate the setting and scene of a film. It's where we gather our teams and our materials. And then as production starts, it's the place where we move in our stars, we place the caravans, it becomes a sort of thriving hub. And when we've got multiple productions happening on the site, these become the centerpieces of each of those productions. So the unit base and how it flows into each of these great big elephant doors into each of these buildings is really important. The back lot to the south, about 2.5 hectares to the south of the site, there's a very distinctive mound down on the site. We heard earlier about the lane of the road we would push south, single track road. It's taking equipment down to the back lot. We've decided, again in discussion with the industry, that the back lot should be formed with all the sophisticated wires and plumbing that it needs. So don't bring in temporary generators, lighting rigs, etc. We will put in the data cables, the power, the water, all the things that are needed to make that work. It's enclosed, a strong landscape structure around it. And in operation, there is a backlot operation plan, I believe, in discussion that will come forward to dictate how this is operated, when it operates, number of days, and scale of buildings that sit on it. But again, it's temporary installations that gives you the opportunity to do something that you can't do in the sound stages, gives you a different part of the offer, an important part of this competitive proposition. So then at the center of the project, to the south of the main buildings, is I suppose our broader recreational offer. The armature of that is our east-west footpath from the Volvo Bridge through to Little Marlow. We have these lower scale buildings overlooking that footpath to the north, and we have views over the lake to the south. We have extended, as it were, that frontage piece in front of Westthorpe Park House, which sits in this very strong tree structure. We've opened up the centre of Block 4 to broader recreational access, and we put our skills and culture centre in the middle of that. And culture centre because it's not just a training venue. I think we've got 60-odd students a year lined up to use this, but it's also a place where we can do events, where we can show films, where we can invite the broader public in. There's the community building that was mentioned earlier. There's just to the north of the Westthorpe Park Homes. And then there's a proposition for a cafe in the ground floor of the multi-storey car park on the footpath to Little Marlow that serves both anyone who's using those footpaths, but critically is part of the amenity for people operating in this halo industry area to the south. And then to the north is our unit base. And the unit base is designed as an iconic building. It's designed to be the heart of the studios. It's the place where we gather. It's the place where we meet our friends, where those serendipitous happenings occur, where we can do film previews, but also it's set up in such a way that from the car park, we can open it to the public for special events, for screenings. So it's secured both to the north from the studios and to the south, and that is flexible. So that building can become the place, I suppose, where Marlow at its greatest extent engages with the cultural offer of the studios, and that building is designed for that purpose. Has a whole range of uses within it. It's a welcoming space. It's hospitality for the workers, but hospitality for events. It's versatile. It's an engaging place. It's a place where we can exhibit elements of what's going on the wider film studio, what productions are going on, but a really important public interface for the studios with the wider community. This was an area of some discussion with the design review panels. We went through 3 design review panels, and they had quite a lot of influence in terms of how this has shaped their views of how we engaged in this. That was a very useful session. So an important building, a building I think that expresses the seriousness of the studio and its commitment to design. Community building, we've talked about, sits close to Westthorpe Park Homes. It's a building that the community can use. It's got facilities within it. We very much hope it will be of use and enjoyed by the community, but it will also provide a bigger function for those wider afield. Our Culture and Skills Academy sits, as it were, to the centre of Plot 4, readily accessible from our footpath system, and our access road sits within that strong landscape structure with the open meadows in front of it. It's a lovely looking building. It's a building I think is appropriate for a cultural centre, appropriate for students to be there. I think it's a really attractive proposition. And it harks back to, again, a point that was made earlier about one of the challenges for the British film and TV industry is training. How do we bring people into the business? How do we make sure that there's that feedstock of skill? It's great having the facilities, it's great having the studios, but you need to be creating the talent. And to me, that is the depth and the long-term guarantee of a sustainable industry is training the people to be in it. That's a massively important part of the project. And has certainly been on our client's radar screen from the absolute get-go. The other thing we did was to make sure that all of our amenity buildings, from plant buildings to cafes, are well designed. Again, this is where people are going to spend significant parts of their lives, different parts of their day, being creative, and firm believer in the idea that powerful, inviting environments create great work and create that sense of loyalty and commitment to place. So these become important buildings, whereas elsewhere you might see there's been converted shipping containers and whatever. Here, those elements are a really important part of the culture we're trying to express. Mr. Dix will talk in detail about access and movements. That's obviously going to be a significant part of the conversation. But just to say that we've designed the internal workings so that we can, as it were, separate parts of the film studio from each other for security and setup. It's a highly managed environment. This is a sort of place you don't just turn up with a truck here. You're booked in, you go to where you're supposed to be. There'll be banksmen and barriers and all of those things to make sure this place works properly. The proposition that we have about extended bus routes connect right into this place and then on down to Westthorpe Park Homes. So we've got improved public transport, improved connectivity. I think it's a really great way of addressing that modal split. And then, of course, there's the improvement to footpaths, cycleways, connections that go with it. And others will talk about those in more detail. The entrance sequence to the north, we think is very important. That's our kind of early statement of intent. Quality of buildings, quality of place, ease of movement through that. A point was made earlier about travelling down to Westthorpe Park House. Just to be clear, for those going down to Westthorpe Park House, there's no need to pass through any for security. That's a free-flowing route down to Westthorpe Park House. The security exists, as it were, to the edges of that and can be controlled in different ways. Our bus stops are outside that. Our car parks are outside the secure ring. So again, the flexibility exists for that group of halo industries to work outside the secure ring. That's the everyday experience of people, is not going through security when they're working in those halo industry areas or passing through to Westthorpe Park and properties to the south. We think streetscape is really important. I think we're finding this on many projects now about how do we animate our streets. I've been very careful about where traffic and transport is relative to our public realm. The idea that places are active, that they're engaging, that we know where we are, that there's a scale to it, we think is really important. And again, I think you'll notice, ma'am, on other studios, we tend to see sort of big island developments, car parking around it. We're really striving here to create the type of craft and engaging place that really makes for a special place to work. So we have a whole variety of street sections. The street sections both deal with pedestrian, cycle and road traffic, but also make sure that we can fit our landscape in, our subsystems. So we have a hierarchy of needs within our streets. They're all set out. And again, I think that gives variety and interest to the place that we're creating. Our streets also have to accommodate a whole raft of additional elements, our sud systems, our ecology structures, our tree planting, our cycleways, our footpaths, all of that's built in. And as we'll see later, our street furniture and all of those things are plotted in. The security line, as it were, of the secure areas are the areas in pink. The larger dots are where we can move vehicles through. The smaller dots are where pedestrian crossings are. We've been very careful about our fencing designs, and again, we've not had any pushback on that, but to, as it were, put most of our security is our building line. Where it isn't our building line, it is either in landscape, or it's actually fronted by smaller, less intrusive fencing, like on Westthorpe Park Lane, where it indicates the difference between public and private, but is not, as it were, threatening, I suppose, in terms of scale or impact. Materiality formed a significant part of our thought processes. So muted, sitting in a landscape, but distinctive elements where they kind of sit within the interface of the project. It's a simple palette, but I think it's a sophisticated palette and reflects the architect's, I think, real strong, powerful design intent. Our street furniture is all selective. It sits to an idea about place, location, from cycle parking to benches to bins, to lighting systems. We've reviewed them all. The lighting strategy is really a strategy of as little lighting as possible. We need to be safe. We need to be able to move around, but we're using our buildings. We're keeping things muted. We recognize that light management is really important. So we have a whole raft of lighting design propositions in here for different conditions, light fittings identified, building lighting systems identified. We will talk about noise strategy later on in the inquiry with a proof of evidence, other than to say that actually it's really important to a film studio that is relatively quiet. We have sound stages, we have areas of where we need to contain our noise. So there is a noise management process to this. And then critically to our southern backlot, we have, you'll hear from the noise expert, but soil bunding, screening is an important part of how that site has been laid out. Our green strategies involve a variety of approaches, from building cladding systems to roof strategies around meadow strategies for roofs, combining that with solar voltaics. I think this combination of solar voltaics and green roof treatments, I think, is proving very successful. That's also a major part of our rainfall management. So we absorb rain onto our roof spaces, we hold it on our roof spaces, and then we let it out, as it were, into the system through our suds. Critically, I suppose, down on the 404, some of our major buildings have a green treatment, have a planted treatment to those facades. Bearing in mind, though, that there's quite a short snapshot when you're on the 404 as you pass the site, not least because of the embankment up to the roundabout. So sustainable drainage is our roof systems, underground tanks where necessary, permeable pavements, swales, and then, of course, a whole series of ponded structures, which again underpin our ecology and the aquatic life on the site. So if that was the project, as it were, at the planning submission, there's been a series of discussions post that. So I just wanted to update on where some of those have gone. All of this evidence was submitted, but the timeline, this starts at 2021. I suppose we were first engaged in 2020, so it's 5 years now that we've been working on this process, a long time. But we're a whole series of, as it were, planning reviews, planning submissions, design advisory groups, and then up to the appeal being lodged last September. So it's been a process that we've worked through over a number of years. Public consultation formed, well, we've heard comments on that today, but it was a significant and I think fairly comprehensive plan, starting, of course, in the time of COVID. So a lot of it was online early on, which had its positive sides as well. I think lots of people could join online. It was interesting sets of conversations. As I said earlier, there were changes to the scheme that came out of those conversations, recognizing though that there were a variety of views within this process, but it was a deep and engaged conversation, and I certainly enjoyed that process. We had the review with the design panel. We went through, I think we put ourselves forward to design review saying we thought it'd be a good idea. We went through 3 design review panel sequences. I found them very useful. It's always great to have that sort of third-party view of where you're going, how you might address issues in a different way. And certainly there was strong support for this idea of intensity of development, of bringing buildings together to get that sort of animated streetscape to be, as it were, efficient with our land use. Something I believed in from the get-go, but we had that reinforced through those conversations, an important part of the discussion. A blank slide there. Essentially, though, that the reports that came back, I think, are in my proof of general, I think, support of the design approach. And as I said earlier, we don't have a design objection. Later on in the process, the design of the northern entrance changed. Mr. Dix again will talk about this. Earlier on, it was a crossroads. It moved to being a roundabout, but the ambition of that design evolution about a great entrance, about safety, about free flow, about flow through for local residents was all maintained. It led to some adjustments to our layouts to make that work, but essentially that all kind of worked in that sort of dialogue between road, buildings and landscape. However, in that process, we took the opportunity to add additional landscape structure to the north side of the road. So we get, as it were, additional screening from the AO and B side. So significantly deepening the screening to the north of the studio space, where we have both landscape on the north side of the site and, of course, the smaller building forms. And then Mr. Dix will talk about the evolution of the Volvo Bridge discussions, but part of our east-west connections through to the footpath, how it operates, and how that is an essential part of that connection east-west across the site. We clarified some points on elevational treatment, roof treatment, as part of the later work. We revised some of those planting plans to make them more naturalistic, make a stronger content for indigenous vegetation. And then we put some additional information in, not changing anything, but just, we thought, a better explanation of the interface with the Westhorpe Park residents, that boundary that was referred to earlier, and a series of, as it were, expanded sections to show that relationship between Westhorpe Park, home Westhorpe Park House, and the development to the north and to the west with the cultural building. And expanded upon in some of these sections just to look at what that looks like. And that is the sort of sensitive boundary that was mentioned earlier between the workshop buildings and Westhorpe Park Homes, and that existing wall here, which you can see on site, and then the landscape buffer in between. And again, the section through from Westhorpe Park House through to the studio space on that east-west section there. So again, no change to the scheme, just a more detailed explanation of what people were looking at. Southern Green Buffer was again explained, reinforced, but just these drawings again, just to expand upon our proposition there in terms of that landscape strength, the setting of the culture and training building, and then the interface on the footpath that runs east-west south of the hub building. So this is where we are today. I think the grayed out areas are our main site through here. Footpath connections across the site. That's our existing position today. What we're proposing, as you've heard, is the development of the studio up against the edge of Marlow, close into the 404, off the existing junction, retaining the access road to Westhorpe Park House, fitting it in a strong landscape structure within, as it were, that, I would say, that kind of area which you associate with the edge of Marlow. The Sang and improvement of our ecological offer further in to the east towards Little Marlow, critically those important connections back to footpaths, and then, as it were, the qualifying and improvement of footpath systems around the culture and open space buildings to the west of Westthorpe Park House. My opinion, this settles well into the landscape, addresses our landscape setting in terms of that tighter, more complete urban form, and makes use, of course, of footpaths and assets and highway connections that exist within the area. So I suppose in summary, I'm lucky enough to work all over the world. I get to see some really extraordinary projects, but I have to say, from a UK point of view, this is an extraordinarily comprehensive scheme. I think the integration of layers from ecology to land use to placemaking to building typologies to the incredible range of architecture that's being proposed is a world-class proposition. On the work we do in terms of creating world-class workspace, this sits up there with all of it. I think my view, is if we're going to stay at the front edge of these global industries, then we need global facilities and a global proposition. And if Mr. Trump wants to rescue Hollywood, well, good luck to him. But the way to compete with Hollywood is not to do anything lesser. It's to take on the best in the world, do better. And I always feel it's a little bit of a British disease to do just enough. I don't think that works. If you want to be top of the tree, do better than anyone else. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Mr. Five. Okay, I'm going to suggest a short adjournment before I give the council and the Rule 6 a chance to ask some questions, along with any interested parties and any questions that I have remaining that have not already then been answered. So it's...
Before we break, Mark,
Yep.
can we just address the eternal question of the layout? Because if Mr. Price sits there, Miss Nevin won't be able to see him. Should we move the desk on this side?
That would be better, yeah.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah, if that desk can just be shifted depending on which side the witness is from, that will help. Yes, could you move it across?
Okay.
It's 20 past, so we'll come back we'll do 15. I'm conscious that there's like not many toilets, is there?
No.
A lot of people. Is 15 minutes enough, or do you want me to break for 20?
20.
20. Right, so if we come back at 20 to 4 and we're adjourned until then, thank you.